Vivian Blackwood had one instruction for the mechanic: take her father's old convertible to an empty lot and burn it before midnight. She paid Caleb Rowan well enough that he shouldn't have asked questions, but when he pulled the passenger door panel to check the fuel lines, he found a name hand-carved into the steel beneath: Vivian, beside a date that predated her official adoption record by nearly 3 years. He had barely lifted his phone to call her when 3 black SUVs rolled up to the garage, carrying a new set of orders. The car had to disappear, and everything inside it with it. Stay with this story to the end and find out why a single carved name was enough to terrify an entire dynasty. 1 week after Everett Blackwood was buried in the family plot outside Charleston, his brother Damien led Vivian through a side corridor of the estate she had known her entire life and stopped before a garage door she had never been permitted to open. He lifted the tarpaulin himself, pulling it back slowly, and beneath it sat a 1967 Ford Mustang convertible in a shade of deep midnight blue that had not been touched in years. Dust had settled along the hood seams and pooled in the crease of the folded canvas top, but the paint underneath still held its color, the way old things sometimes do when they have been kept from the light. Vivian recognized it immediately, not because she had ever sat inside it, but because her father had made clear from the time she was a child that this particular car was not to be touched, examined, or discussed. Damien set a manila folder on the hood and told her the car's informal name, Bluebird, was the least of its problems. The folder contained a summary he said had been prepared by the company's legal team, documenting what Damien described as Everett's greatest act of self-sabotage. According to his account, a woman named Claire Bennett had once worked inside the Blackwood Engineering Division during the company's early years, and she and Everett had together used proprietary blueprints to build an unauthorized prototype, a convertible meant to demonstrate a technology Blackwood had not yet filed under its own name. When the arrangement soured, Damien explained, Claire had taken copies of the design work and fled Charleston, leaving behind a scandal that the family had spent decades quietly managing. The story Vivian had always been told about her earliest years, that she had come from a family too troubled to care for her, that Everett had taken her in at age 3 out of simple compassion, fit neatly alongside Damien's version of events, and she had no immediate reason to doubt either one. What she did not yet understand was that the two stories had been constructed together, each one lending the other a credibility neither deserved on its own. Damien told her that with the acquisition of Blackwood's Heritage Division now weeks away from closing, the existence of the Bluebird created a liability that neither the board nor the overseas buyer could afford to have surfaced during due diligence. A competing claim to the prototype's design history could open questions about patent ownership, revenue attribution, and the legitimacy of the very department being sold. He presented the destruction of the car not as an act of grief or anger, but as a routine corporate necessity, the responsible conclusion to a chapter that had already cost the family enough. Vivian stood in the garage for a long moment without speaking. She had spent the week since her father's death absorbing the specific loneliness of inheriting a company she had not yet fully made her own, and the idea that the Bluebird represented one more piece of Everett's hidden life made the silence between them feel heavier than it had any right to. She told Damien she did not want the car auctioned, donated to a museum, or handed over to anyone connected to the company. She wanted it gone in a way that left nothing behind to be catalogued, photographed, or argued over. Damien suggested a licensed industrial processing firm the company had used before, but Vivian shook her head. She did not want anyone inside the Blackwood orbit involved in this particular job, and the reason she gave was simple enough. She did not want the board to have any reason to revisit the decision later. She remembered that her father had once praised a small garage on the outskirts of Charleston a one-man operation run by a mechanic named Caleb Rowan, who had briefly consulted for the company's heritage program before resigning over a disagreement about parts authenticity. Rowan was independent, discreet, and by all accounts the kind of man who finished what he was paid to finish. She had her assistant locate his number within the hour. Caleb answered on the second ring, and when Vivienne explained what she needed, he went quiet for several seconds, before asking if she understood what she was asking him to destroy. She told him she understood exactly. The fee she named was more than 3 times his garage's average monthly revenue, and he accepted the job before the call ended. What Vivienne did not know was that when Caleb pulled the Bluebird onto his lift and began the standard pre-disposal inspection, draining fluids, checking for pressure vessels, identifying anything that might combust unpredictably, he would find that this was not a standard car. What she also did not know was that Damien had placed a call of his own within minutes of her driving away from the estate, instructing someone to follow the car and retrieve it immediately if the mechanic so much as opened a door panel. Caleb had been taking apart cars for more than 2 decades, and he had learned that the fastest way to understand what a vehicle actually was required ignoring what it was supposed to be. He began with the engine bay, and what he found there was technically a Mustang, the block, the carburetor, the basic architecture, but the fabrication around it showed hands that had gone well beyond the factory spec. Welds along the firewall had been finished by someone with real skill, not production line speed, and the fuel lines had been routed in a configuration he had never seen on a standard 1967 model. The convertible top mechanism, when he manually cycled it, moved on a pivot system that did not match any factory design he could identify in his reference books. He photographed everything methodically, not because he planned to expose anything, but because he had long ago established the habit of documenting a vehicle's condition before any work began, a practice that had saved him from disputes more than once. Owen Price, his longtime friend and the operator of a licensed salvage yard 2 miles down the road, stopped by mid-afternoon and leaned against the bay wall watching Caleb work. Owen told him, without particular subtlety, that a car belonging to the Blackwood family was not one to examine too closely when the job description read "burn it." Caleb acknowledged this without looking up from the undercarriage. He explained that he was not examining it out of curiosity. He was legally obligated to neutralize hazardous materials before any kind of thermal disposal, and in a car this old and this modified, that meant pulling interior panels to reach the fuel delivery components safely. Owen said he understood the argument and did not entirely believe it. Caleb set down his ratchet, looked at his friend, and said that he was filming the process and that if anything unusual turned up, he would call the client before doing anything further. It was the most honest answer he could give, and Owen accepted it the way old friends accept answers they find half convincing. The passenger door was the third panel Caleb removed. The interior of the door cavity was clean, which itself was unusual in a car this age. No accumulated debris, no corrosion around the drain holes, as if someone had at some point carefully cleaned it out. He was reaching for the fuel line access point when the beam of his flashlight caught something on the inner face of the door skin, not painted on, not stamped, but cut by hand into the bare steel. He pulled the panel further and read it slowly. For Vivienne, may you always ride beneath an open sky. CB 1988. He read it a second time. He set the flashlight down and picked up his phone to photograph the inscription, checking the date against what he remembered from the contract documents Vivienne's office had sent over. Her adoption paperwork, which had been attached as part of the vehicle's ownership history, listed her official entry into the Blackwood household as 1991. The inscription was dated 3 years before that. The initials CB matched the name Claire Bennett, which Vivienne had mentioned only in passing during their phone call, as a person associated with an embarrassing episode in the company's past. Beside the inscription, carved with the same tool in a lighter hand, was a small symbol. A bird with its wings open, rendered simply, almost like a child's drawing but precise in the way only an engineer's hand could be. Caleb called Vivienne's office and was told she was in a board session that would run for several more hours. He sent a photograph of the inscription to the number on his contract. The image showed as delivered but did not register as opened. He had been staring at the photo on his own screen for less than 10 minutes when the sound of tires on gravel reached him through the open bay door, and he stepped out to find 3 black SUVs parked in a line across his lot. 4 men in business dress climbed out. The one who spoke first presented a document printed on Blackwood Industries letterhead, signed with what appeared to be Vivienne's digital signature, redirecting the vehicle to a different processing facility effective immediately. Caleb read the document twice. The signature formatting did not match the one on his original contract. The font spacing was different, and the document ID number was structured differently from the one Vivienne's office used. He told them he would release the vehicle only after speaking directly with Ms. Blackwood. The man who had spoken first did not raise his voice. He simply noted, with the specific calm of someone accustomed to being obeyed, that Caleb's operating licenses were due for their annual municipal review, and that reviews had a way of moving up the calendar when inspectors received inquiries. Caleb thanked him for the information and said he would still need to hear from the vehicle's owner before releasing it. After they left, he called Owen. By 9 that evening, the Bluebird was in an unmarked storage unit 20 minutes from the garage, covered under Owen's name, and Caleb was sitting alone in his empty bay reading a text from Vivienne that contained only 5 words. "Why is my name there?" Vivienne arrived at the garage before 8 the following morning, alone, without the town car or the assistant who normally shadowed her professional movements. She had dressed simply, and Caleb noticed she moved through the space the way people move through places that unsettle them. Carefully, attentively, not yet ready to settle on what they think. He showed her the door panel without preamble, and she crouched beside it for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said the handwriting on the CB inscription looked like the handwriting in a card she had received on her 16th birthday, unsigned, written in an old-fashioned cursive, mentioning that she had her mother's ability to see beauty in mechanical things. Damien had taken the card away within a day of its arrival, telling her it had come from a person who had been obsessed with the Blackwood family for years and that she should not be unsettled by it. She had believed him then. Caleb pointed out that the inscription was beneath a door liner that showed no evidence of having been removed in decades. The factory adhesive was intact and oxidized, the kind of aging that could not be manufactured recently. He walked her through the rest of what he had observed. The chassis showed fabrication signatures from at least 2 distinct workers. The mechanical components had been built by someone with a preference for structural precision and efficiency, while the body panels and folding roof mechanism reflected a different kind of intelligence, one interested in elegance, in the way a surface could be shaped to move through air or fold cleanly into itself. Under the passenger seat, faint but legible, were 2 sets of stamped tool marks on the metal floor, EB and CB. They were the kind of marks craftspeople used to identify their own work areas, a habit common in small prototyped shops where accountability mattered. Claire Bennett had not simply ridden in this car. She had built half of it. Vivienne stood up slowly and looked at Caleb with an expression that mixed something like controlled anger with something older and harder to name. She told him she was aware that a car with this kind of story attached to it would be worth significantly more than a car without one, and that she was not naive about the incentives a struggling garage owner might have to construct a narrative around a routine disposal job. Caleb did not argue with her. He picked up the keys from the workbench and held them out. He told her she could take the car wherever she chose and do with it whatever she had originally planned. The fact that he made no attempt to negotiate, no move to leverage what he had found, stopped her more completely than any argument could have. She did not take the keys. After a long silence, Caleb said he only had one question before she decided, if her father had genuinely wanted this secret destroyed, why had he kept the car in a private garage on the family estate where he could be absolutely certain she would one day encounter it? Vivienne did not answer that question, but she also did not leave. It was while they were examining the folding roof mechanism that Caleb found the anomaly, a crossbar in the rear section of the convertible top frame that was fractionally heavier than it should have been, heavier than any structural purpose required. He worked it loose carefully, and from inside the hollow steel bar, he extracted a rolled piece of cloth. Inside the cloth was a small magnetic tape cassette, the kind used for personal recording in the late 1980s, and a brass key stamped with the number 214. The label on the cassette was written in the same hand as the inscription, "Vivi, when you're ready." Vivienne took the cassette and held it without speaking. Vivi was the name her father had called her only when no one else was present. Not a public name, not a formal name, a name that belonged to a version of their relationship that existed entirely outside the machinery of the Blackwood household. Before either of them could say anything further, the garage's overhead lights went dark, and the fire alarm on the east wall began to sound, sharp and continuous, though the air around them was completely clear. Caleb moved quickly to the breaker panel and found that the main exterior disconnect had been manually switched off. Not a tripped breaker, not a power surge, but a deliberate action that required someone to access the side of the building. He checked the perimeter and found nothing except a fresh set of boot prints in the gravel alongside the wall. Whoever had done it had not come inside, had not disturbed any equipment, had not taken anything. The sole purpose had been to create enough confusion and noise to move two people away from a car in a storage bay. He switched to the backup circuit from the generator he kept for extended jobs and connected an old cassette player he found on a shelf near his parts inventory. The tape played with a slight hiss of age beneath the recording, and the voice that came through was Everett Blackwood's, but older, more measured than the man Vivienne had known in her childhood, the voice of someone who had rehearsed what he intended to say and still found it difficult to say it. Everett began by addressing Vivienne directly, using her full name, and then almost immediately correcting himself to Vivi, as if the formality embarrassed him. He told her that Claire Bennett was not a thief. He told her that Claire Bennett was her mother. He explained that he and Claire had built the Bluebird together during the years before Blackwood Industries became the company it eventually became. Years when Everett was still an engineer rather than an executive, when he and Claire had shared a workshop and a set of ambitions and, eventually, a life that the Blackwood family structure had never been designed to accommodate. When Vivienne was born, the pressure from Everett's father and from Damien had been immediate, methodical, and ultimately successful. Claire had been presented with a legal arrangement that offered her a small financial settlement and the threat of a criminal investigation into the design documents she had co-authored, framed as theft of proprietary company materials. Everett had not fought hard enough to stop it. He said this plainly and without trying to soften it. He had been afraid of losing his position in the company, afraid of his father's displeasure, afraid of the specific kind of social and professional destruction that Damien had always been expert at engineering. He had failed Claire. He had failed Vivienne. He had spent the following decades failing to correct it. He said he had established a trust designed to restore Claire's equity in the Heritage Division and to transfer a controlling block of voting shares to Vivienne upon his death, but that activating the trust required proof that the Bluebird was the original prototype and that the inscription predated Damien's patent filings. The tape ran for another 30 seconds and then cut to silence in the middle of a sentence. Everett had been about to identify where the primary legal documentation was stored, and the recording simply stopped. The cassette had been damaged at some point, and the final portion of his message had not survived. Vivienne sat in the passenger seat of a car that was not yet fully reassembled, in a garage that smelled of mineral oil and old steel, holding a cassette player in her lap, and said nothing for a long time. Caleb examined the brass key. The 214 was stamped cleanly, and beneath the number was a small engraved outline of an arch and a fence rail, the architectural mark used by Blackwood Terminal, the family's original freight handling facility south of the city, now largely decommissioned, the kind of place that appeared in company histories, but not in current operational records. He told Vivienne they needed to move carefully. Damien knew the car had been found and that Caleb had examined it. Using a company phone or a company vehicle to travel across the city would make their movements visible to anyone monitoring Blackwood's communication infrastructure. Vivienne looked at the bench seat of Caleb's pickup truck through the open bay door and said she had not ridden in a vehicle without climate control in approximately 15 years. Caleb said that was probably fine. They drove south in Caleb's truck with the windows down, and the city transitioning around them from the older residential blocks near his garage into the industrial waterfront corridor, where the Blackwood Terminal building had stood since the 1920s. Vivienne did not speak for the first several minutes, and Caleb did not push her. When she finally did speak, she said she had spent her entire adult life trying to be the person Everett had needed her to be, decisive, controlled, protective of the family's standing, and that she had always assumed that effort was a fair exchange for belonging to something larger than herself. She said it differently than that, more carefully, but that was the substance of what she meant. Caleb thought about his wife, who had died 7 years earlier, and about the way he had responded to that loss by reducing his life to its most essential and defensible forms: the garage, Sadie, the work. He told Vivienne that the objects people leave behind carry the weight of things they never figured out how to say directly, and that he had learned to listen to what those objects were actually telling him rather than what he hoped they meant. He said Everett's truth, whatever it turned out to be, would not automatically make Vivienne love him less. It would just require her to see him as a man who had made real choices rather than a figure defined entirely by what he had given her. She told him no one had ever said something like that to her without immediately following it up with a recommendation about how to manage the situation publicly. Caleb said he did not have a public relations strategy to offer. She looked out the window and almost smiled. The storage section of Blackwood Terminal was in the building's lower level, accessible through a side entrance that had not been updated since the building's partial renovation in the early 2000s. Key 214 fit the lock on a row of narrow archive cabinets that lined the far wall of the space. When Caleb turned the key and opened the drawer, they found a single manila envelope and, resting on top of it, a folded note. The envelope was empty. The note had been written recently. The ink was fresh, the paper undiscolored. It said, "You are 38 years too late." Caleb crouched beside the cabinet and examined the dust pattern on the surrounding floor. The disruption was recent, days old, not weeks, and the disturbed zone extended from the cabinet to the far wall, suggesting someone had moved items out in some volume, not simply opened a single drawer. He checked the gap between the cabinet's back panel and the wall and found a corner of an envelope caught in the frame, torn as if it had fallen and been missed during a hasty retrieval. The return address printed on the remaining corner read Claire Bennett, Portland, Maine. He showed it to Vivienne in silence. 15 minutes later, a woman appeared at the terminal's side entrance. She was in her middle 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a document bag with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she had been ready to move at short notice for some time. She identified herself as Marissa Vale and explained that she had received an alert from a passive sensor embedded in the brass key, a mechanism Everett had commissioned specifically to notify her if the key was ever used. She had been Everett's outside counsel for the past 12 years, operating entirely separately from Blackwood's internal legal team, and her instructions had been simple: remain available, act only when the Bluebird was located and the key was turned. Marissa explained that Everett had never trusted a single storage location with a complete chain of evidence, because Damien had spent years consolidating control over the company's legal, communications, and security infrastructure. The archive cabinet had held a portion of the documentation, but the most critical materials, the original design contracts, the trust instrument, and the correspondence record, had been divided and kept in 3 separate locations, only one of which Damien's people had apparently found. She produced from her document bag a bound collection of photocopies, letters, all addressed to Vivienne Blackwood at the family estate, all bearing Claire Bennett's Portland return address, spanning a period from 1994 to 2014. There were 47 of them. Everyone had been returned to the sender by the Blackwood family office with a form notation indicating that the recipient had declined correspondence. Vivienne had never seen a single one. Marissa laid out what the trust documents described, speaking with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the explanation many times without knowing exactly when she would need to deliver it. Claire Bennett had designed the folding convertible roof mechanism that became the foundation of Blackwood's Heritage Division manufacturing process. She had been verbally promised an 18% equity stake in the division during the prototype phase. When the company formalized its structure, Damien had substituted a non-disclosure and non-compete agreement for the equity contract, threatening Claire with a fabricated intellectual property theft claim if she refused to sign. The revenue generated by her design had compounded across decades into the financial core of the Heritage Division. The same division now being sold to an overseas consortium for a sum that would erase the liability if the sale closed before anyone audited the original patent filings. Everett had established the trust specifically to correct this. It would restore Claire's equity attribution and transfer to Vivienne a voting block large enough to prevent any division sale without her direct consent. To activate it, they needed to establish through independent verification that the Bluebird was the original prototype, that the inscription predated Damien's patent applications, and that Claire's tool marks established co-authorship of the design. If those 3 conditions could be documented, the trust would supersede Damien's board majority on any vote affecting the Heritage Division. Vivienne absorbed all of this without interrupting. Before Marissa finished, both their phones registered the same news notification. Blackwood Industries had filed a complaint with city law enforcement, alleging that a former contractor named Caleb Rowan had stolen a vehicle valued at several $1 million from the Blackwood estate and was using it to extort the company's CEO. The account freeze on Rowan Heritage Garage processed the following morning. Caleb discovered it when an automatic payment for a parts order failed, and within 2 hours the city's licensing office had contacted him to schedule what they described as a routine compliance review of his hazardous materials storage and business registration. By noon, 3 of his standing client accounts had sent politely worded messages placing their vehicles on indefinite hold pending resolution of what one of them called an ongoing legal situation. A photograph taken through his garage window, Caleb and Vivienne standing beside the disassembled door panel the previous afternoon, had appeared in a business news publication beneath a headline that described an unnamed mechanic leveraging a grieving executive's emotional state for financial gain. The photograph had been taken without either of them being aware of it, which confirmed that Damien's people had been on the property while they were inside examining the car. Vivian came to the garage that afternoon and offered to retire his outstanding business loans, assign her personal legal team to his defense, and issue a public statement clearing his name. Caleb listened to all of it and then told her he could not accept money paid to him personally, because accepting it would confirm the exact narrative being constructed against him, that he had taken the car in exchange for financial concessions from a wealthy client. What he needed from her was simpler and harder. He needed her to publicly confirm in her own name that she had contracted him voluntarily and that she had never been coerced. Vivian stood at the edge of his workbench and looked at the floor. She said that making that statement before they had the complete evidence in hand would mean openly opposing Damien before the board had any reason to take her side, and that she was not certain the outcome would be survivable for the company. Caleb told her that Damien had spent a lifetime keeping her afraid of exactly that calculation, and that it worked because she had let herself believe that every ethical choice she might make carried an automatic catastrophic price tag. He was not unkind when he said it. He was direct in the way people are direct when they have nothing to protect except the truth. Vivian did not respond to him immediately. She picked up her keys and left, and Caleb sat alone in the garage listening to the particular silence of a space that had been his family's livelihood for a long time and might not be for much longer. That evening, Sadie called from her dormitory, having seen the news item on a campus newsfeed. Caleb told her it was complicated and that she should not worry. She said she was not worried, that she was annoyed, and then she said something he had not expected her to say. She told him he had always explained restoration work to her as the practice of keeping the truth of an object intact rather than making it look like something it had never been, and that she hoped he was applying the same principle to himself. He did not answer her right away. He sat with what she had said until it stopped sounding like a compliment and started sounding like instruction. The next morning, Vivian walked into a scheduled board session and, before the agenda item for the Heritage Division sale could be called, stated plainly that she had engaged Caleb Rowan as an independent contractor, that the engagement had been voluntary, that she had not been coerced, and that she was requesting a formal postponement of the division sale, pending an independent review of the division's patent history. Damien moved immediately to table her request and called for a confidence vote. He had the numbers, and the motion to delay the sale failed. Vivian voted against it alone. On his way out of the chamber, Damien handed her his phone. The screen showed a security camera image. Claire Bennett, walking through the lobby of the Blackwood Industries building in downtown Charleston at 11:47 the previous evening. Vivian's first instinct when she saw the footage was to conclude that Claire had been working with Damien all along, that the archive cabinet had been emptied not by his operatives, but by the woman who knew exactly what it contained. She said this to Caleb, and he heard the specific quality of the accusation. It was the conclusion of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to suspect the people most likely to have loved her. He told her the footage showed Claire entering a building, not a motive, and that there was a considerable distance between the two. They found Claire at a small hotel on the edge of the historic district, registered under a name Caleb, recognized as her family name before her marriage, a name that would not appear in any Blackwood system. She opened the door when they knocked and did not appear surprised to see either of them. Claire did not pretend the meeting with Damien had not happened. She told them she had received word of Everett's death through a former colleague, and shortly after, she had received a message from Damien offering to return a portion of the royalties she had been owed for decades, if she would sign a sworn affidavit stating that she had voluntarily relinquished her parental rights and had separately and willingly transferred the convertible roof design to Blackwood Industries without any prior agreement or expectation of equity. She had gone to his office pretending to consider the offer. While she was there, she had asked to use the restroom adjacent to his private archive room, and she had used that access to retrieve a folder she had known he kept there. Not the trust document which he had moved, but the original non-disclosure agreement Blackwood's legal team had coerced her into signing, which contained language that directly contradicted his public account of the arrangement. She had the folder with her. She placed it on the table between them. Vivian asked her why she had not come forward publicly before, not cruelly, but with the full weight of 20 years of unanswered questions behind it. Claire said she had been afraid, and then said she had been ashamed, and then said she had eventually convinced herself that Vivian had received her letters and had made a considered choice to remain a Blackwood, and that appearing and disrupting that life would cause more damage than absence already had. She said she had been wrong about that. She did not present it as an excuse. Caleb moved to the far side of the room and found something to do with his hands, giving the two women the full distance the conversation required. He had learned, in the years since his wife died, the particular skill of being present without occupying the center of a moment that did not belong to him. What they still lacked was the trust document itself, the one that would give Vivienne the voting authority to block the sale. Claire told them Everett had always kept the final copy somewhere that bore all three signatures, his, hers, and the notary's, somewhere connected to all three of them. Caleb asked what she meant by connected. She said Everett had told her once, years before his death, that the most important things he had ever made were the Bluebird and Vivian, and that he had tried to keep them close to each other when he could not keep himself close to either. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he walked out to his truck, called Owen, and told him to meet them at the storage unit in 45 minutes and bring a socket set. The convertible top mechanism, when fully disassembled, revealed a secondary cross member running the width of the frame at the rear of the roof structure, a bar that served no structural purpose Caleb could identify in standard engineering terms. He worked it loose over the course of 20 minutes and removed the end cap on the driver's side. Inside the hollow tube was a sealed aluminum sleeve, the kind used for archival document storage, waterproofed and crimped at both ends. He passed it to Vivienne. She opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a trust instrument dated 1993, bearing Everett's signature and Claire's signature, and a notary seal, a technical drawing of the convertible roof mechanism with both EB and CB attributed in the drafting block, and a photograph, small and faded, of Everett and Claire standing beside the Bluebird on what appeared to be a coastal road, with a child, perhaps 2 years old, sitting on the hood and laughing at something out of frame. The child was wearing a blue dress. On the back of the photograph, in Everett's handwriting, Vivi's first ride, 1989. Before they could reach Marissa, Vivian's phone notified her that Blackwood Industries had issued a public statement announcing that Caleb Rowan's contract had been formally terminated and that the Bluebird would be ceremonially processed the following morning at the company's original manufacturing facility. A public event framed as Blackwood Industries closing a difficult chapter and preparing for its next evolution. The event had been designed as a statement. Damien had invited the full board, the lead representatives from the acquiring consortium, and a selection of business press, framing the destruction of the Bluebird as a voluntary act of corporate clarity. The company choosing transparency over sentiment, the family electing to move forward cleanly. He had issued a press release under Vivian's digital signature condemning what he described as a coordinated effort by a disgruntled former contractor to manufacture false provenance claims around a vehicle he had been hired to dispose of legally. The morning of the event, the manufacturing facility was staffed, lit, and running. The Bluebird, or what Damien believed to be the Bluebird, sat beneath a ceremonial cover at the center of the processing floor, positioned in front of the industrial disposal unit that had been brought in specifically for the occasion. Vivienne had called Marissa the night before. The plan they agreed on was straightforward in concept and required a specific kind of nerve to execute. Owen had located a donor vehicle, a 1967 Mustang Coupe in comparable condition, which had been covered and positioned in the storage lot where Damien's people expected the Bluebird to be. When Damien's retrieval team had collected it in the early hours of the morning, they had taken the wrong car. The actual Bluebird had been transported overnight to an independent materials analysis laboratory that Marissa had engaged, where a forensic specialist in automotive metallurgy had been working since 3 in the morning on a documented examination of the door inscription, the chassis number, and the tool markings. Vivienne arrived at the facility alone, without security, and when Damien greeted her at the entrance, she accepted his welcome without any indication of what she knew. He asked her to sign the acquisition agreement before the disposal ceremony began, explaining that the timing would send a cleaner message to the market. Vivienne looked at the document and asked him a single question: if the car had no legal significance, if the provenance claims were fabricated and the inscriptions recent, why did the document's timeline require the vehicle to be destroyed before the independent audit of the Heritage Division's patent history concluded next month? Damien told her she was overthinking it. Vivienne said she was trying to understand and repeated the question. The microphone system at the front of the facility, which had been open for the press contingent, was still active. The board members, standing 15 feet away, heard him tell her that Everett had been foolish enough to believe he could use the car to undo 30 years of family decisions, and that whatever was in that car had been Claire Bennett's problem long before it became Vivienne's, and that Claire Bennett had been removed from the company's history for good reasons that did not need to be revisited by a mechanic with a grudge and a talent for storytelling. The sound of an old engine came from the access road outside, a specific engine note, throaty and uneven in the way 1967 V8s were uneven when they had not been fully warmed up, distinctive in the way mechanical voices are distinctive when they belong to something built by specific hands. Caleb drove the Bluebird through the open bay door of the manufacturing facility with Claire in the passenger seat. Marissa walked in behind them carrying a document folder. The board turned. The press turned. Damien did not move. Caleb parked the car in the center of the room and stepped out without theatrics, and Marissa laid the documents on the nearest work surface and began to explain, in the measured tone of someone delivering a prepared legal statement, what each item established and what it meant for the company's governance structure. The forensic report confirmed that the inscription's metallic oxide layer was consistent with steel exposed to air for a minimum of 30 years and showed no chemical evidence of recent tooling. The trust instrument gave Vivienne the votes she needed to block the sale. The design drawings, authenticated by the inscription and the tool marks, established Claire as co-author of the technology on which the Heritage Division had been built. Damien looked at Vivienne. She looked back at him across the floor of a building that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, and she said the only thing worth saying in a room full of people who had just heard a man confirm, in his own words, what he had spent decades denying. She told them the only thing being destroyed that morning was the lie. The board voted within 48 hours to suspend Damien from his chairmanship pending an independent investigation. The investigation, once underway, moved with the momentum that financial misconduct investigations develop when the primary subject has been operating with unchecked authority for a long time. Each document examined revealed additional documents worth examining. Each account traced open subsidiary accounts that should not have existed. The royalty diversions alone had been running for more than 20 years, routed through holding companies in 3 states. The Heritage Division sale was formally canceled. Vivian issued a public statement acknowledging that she had nearly authorized the destruction of the vehicle and the evidence it contained, and that the responsibility for nearly allowing that to happen was hers to own. She did not frame it as a mistake made under emotional duress. She framed it as a failure of judgment she intended to correct. Within 60 days of the board action, the company's official patent and design records were amended to reflect Claire Bennett's co-authorship of the convertible roof mechanism, and the Heritage Division was renamed the Bennett-Blackwood Heritage Program. The scholarships it funded for young women pursuing mechanical engineering and industrial design were announced at the same time. Vivian and Claire did not arrive at an easy resolution. There was no scene in which decades of absence collapsed into warmth. What they arrived at in the weeks following the board action was a series of conversations, short at first, then longer, conducted without lawyers or cameras, in which 2 people who had both been told a false story about each other began the slow work of replacing that story with something that actually fit the evidence. Claire did not ask for equity or acknowledgement in the form of money. She asked for her name in the record and for the truth in the public account. Vivian gave her both and understood, in doing so, that forgiveness was not the erasure of what had been lost. It was the decision to stop allowing the loss to determine what came next. The charges against Caleb were formally withdrawn. The city licensing office sent a letter confirming that the inspection request had originated from an address associated with one of Damien's subsidiaries, and Caleb filed it without a word in the same drawer where he kept old parts invoices and client release forms. Vivian made a second offer to acquire Rowan Heritage Garage, with a higher figure and a more generous operational structure than the first. Caleb declined the acquisition again and proposed instead an independent contractor arrangement. Specific vehicles, mutually agreed terms, full professional autonomy, nothing transferred in ownership. Vivian signed the contract the same day it was drafted and did not attempt to negotiate any of the conditions. It was the first business agreement she had signed in years that felt like an agreement rather than an instrument. He asked her once, in the garage after the paperwork was done, what had made her willing to bet on a piece of evidence as small as a name carved into a car door. She said she had not bet on the evidence. She had bet on the man who refused to let it disappear. He said that was a generous interpretation. She said it was an accurate one. The tow line between them had been pulled taut by circumstances that left neither of them much room for pretense, and what had grown in that space was not the product of romantic design, but of the specific intimacy that develops between people who have watched each other choose honesty over convenience more than once. Caleb told her he thought she needed time, real time, not politely observed time, to understand the shape of her life as it actually was, rather than as it had been constructed for her. She told him she agreed with that, and that she also intended to be very clear about the fact that she had no plans to remove him from it. The Bluebird was ready in late autumn. Caleb had worked on it across 6 weeks, doing only what was necessary, cleaning the mechanicals, addressing the rust at the rear quarter panels, replacing the weather stripping around the top so it sealed properly when raised. He left the scratches on the rear bumper that had been there when the car arrived. He left the patina on the chrome door handles. He left the inscription exactly as he had found it, and photographed it again once the car was complete, in good light, so the documentation was clear and permanent. The car became the centerpiece of an exhibition at the Charleston Heritage Center, mounted under the title The Bennett Blackwood Prototype. Origins of a Design. Every panel label credited both names. Claire attended the opening and stood beside the car for photographs, which she had not been photographed beside in nearly 40 years. Vivian introduced her as the co-designer of the car, and as her mother, in that order, without hesitation, in front of the assembled press and board members, and the small crowd of engineering students who had come on scholarship invitations. Sadie drove down from her university for the opening weekend and met Vivian in the museum's courtyard during the reception. Caleb watched from across the room. He could not hear the conversation, but he could see Sadie laugh at something, genuinely, the way she laughed when she was surprised by something she found unexpectedly right. Later, in the parking lot, Sadie told him she had noticed he was wearing a collared shirt. He said he had not been aware of that. She said she was certain he had been completely aware of it, and left the subject there. On the Sunday after the opening, Vivian drove to the garage and asked Caleb if he would come with her. She had the keys to the Bluebird. He followed her to the Heritage Center's loading bay, where the car had been released for its first post-restoration road test, and when she opened the driver's door and looked at him, he told her this was her car. It had always been made for her, and she should drive it. She adjusted the mirror and sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment, before she reached down and lowered the convertible top. The mechanism worked exactly as it had been designed to work, folding cleanly and settling into its compartment without a sound. The coastal road they took ran south from the city along a stretch of barrier island that had not changed much in 60 years, and the afternoon sky above it was the specific shade of blue that belongs to the transition between late summer and early fall, wide and unhurried, the kind of sky that makes the horizon look like a beginning. She had told him once that she had wanted to burn the car because she believed that destroying the past was the same thing as escaping it. She understood now that the past was not destroyed by fire. It was only freed by honesty, by letting it be exactly what it had been, fully and without management, until it no longer had the power to pretend to be something else. Caleb said a mechanic could not guarantee smooth roads. He could promise not to leave when the engine made a noise he did not immediately understand. The Bluebird moved down the coast road under a sky that had room for all of it. The grief, the years, the names that had been hidden, and the names that had finally been spoken. The inscription was still there beneath the door panel, invisible from the outside, where Claire had placed it the year Vivian was born. For a child who would one day ride beneath an open sky, in the car that two people had built together before the world convinced them they were not allowed to. That name had started all of it, and now, with the road ahead, and the top folded down and the right people finally in the right seats, it was simply the beginning of what came next.
Dear brother, your edge needs honing. Good. I was in need of a back scratcher.
Shit. Shit.
Open your eyes.
Oh shoot. Oh, that's a good move.
In the court's name.
Can't beat that. Feels so weird not being able to parry. I hate parrying, but I got so used to it. Now I kind of love parrying. Feels nice when you get a perfect parry. Feels good though. But not to the extent of like, God, what's the game where you have to parry? What's the game I quit so bad, guys? The first game? Oh, I don't think anybody here remembers that actually. What's a Souls game that's super parry heavy? I can't think of it right now.